He materialized from the past, looking like a well-groomed old demon. Schopenhauer. Suddenly, he was just sitting there, on a TV set saturated with cold lights and lukewarm certainties. Across from him, the usual panel. Pressed, their tongues well-oiled, their egos inflated, the host, with a display window smile, introduced him as an exclusivity. Schopenhauer, dry, precise, and calm, simply replied, "I haven't resurrected for your pleasure. I've come to see why speech has been replaced by foam." A nervous laugh rippled across the table. One panelist, all chic jacket and camera-wear glances, tried to explain, "Master, our era is complex. Here, we debate, we nuance." Schopenhauer didn't blink. You recite, you slice, you applaud yourselves, you do not nuance. Nuance requires losing a bit of oneself, so it has no place here. I was watching from the wings, notebook in hand. The discomfort in the studio was electric, because what I saw wasn't a discussion, it was an autopsy. And it turns out the tools he was using are the same ones used against us every single day. That opening story really sets the scene perfectly for what we're doing today.
Our mission really is to conduct that autopsy on modern arguments, especially the ones you see playing out online. We want to understand the structure, the anatomy of a digital argument. We're not really aiming for agreement here. The goal is to unpack the toolkit people use when the priority is winning, not necessarily finding the truth. We're looking at how these strategies, some of them centuries old, laid out by Schopenhauer, are still incredibly relevant. They get amplified in digital spaces, shifting everything away from rational discussion towards more emotional manipulation.
It's quite striking, actually. Schopenhauer basically diagnosed this almost 200 years ago. He drew this crucial distinction between dialectic and heuristic. Dialectic is, well, the ideal, isn't it? It's this collaborative search for objective truth using reason, logic.
The kind of debate we like to think happens or should happen.
Exactly. But then there's heuristic. And heuristic is purely about winning the argument, achieving rhetorical victory, whatever it takes. Truth is secondary if it matters at all.
So dialectic is maybe the philosophy seminar, and heuristic is, well, it's the comment section, isn't it? Or maybe a cable news shouting match?
Precisely. The moment winning becomes the goal, and especially when there's an audience involved.
Ah, the audience. That's key.
It really is, because you're not trying to convince your opponent anymore. You're playing to the crowd. You're trying to manipulate the perception of the silent majority watching.
And that makes the digital space a perfect arena for heuristic arguments.
Overwhelmingly so. The structure often rewards visibility, engagement, the appearance of victory. And Schopenhauer, maybe cynically, maybe realistically, gave us the playbook for exactly that.
Okay, let's dive into this playbook. Schopenhauer's 38 stratagems. This isn't about how to be right. It's about how to look right, how to win.
It is. It's a pretty cynical piece of work, but undeniably insightful about how arguments often unfold in reality. These strategies work because they sidestep the actual substance. They go after logical weaknesses, psychological vulnerabilities in the opponent, or they manipulate the audience.
The audience again. Always the audience.
Almost always in heuristic contexts. They exploit biases, attention spans, emotions, everything but pure reason. Hashtag 1.1, strategies of exaggeration and redefinition.
All right, let's start with maybe the most common one you see everywhere online. Exaggeration.
Yes. Stratagem 1. The core idea is simple. Take what your opponent says and stretch it. Push it beyond its reasonable intended limits. Exaggerate it.
Make it bigger, broader.
Exactly. Because the broader and more general a statement is, the easier it is to attack. You create this huge, overblown version of their argument.
Like if someone suggests, I don't know, a modest regulation on something?
You immediately frame it as them wanting total control, complete shutdown, the most extreme version possible. Oh, so you want to ban everything? That kind of move.
It's the classic straw man, right? Build up something weak just to knock it down easily.
Precisely. And the flip side, which is stratagem 23, is if someone tries to do that to your argument, you have to immediately pull it back. Redefine your terms, make your point as narrow and specific as possible. No, I'm only talking about this very specific instance.
Defend the boundaries of your claim.
You have to, otherwise they'll paint you into an extreme corner.
Okay, then there are the language games. Stratagems 2 and 3, about deliberate misdirection.
Yeah, this is about twisting the meaning. When you know you can't really refute what they actually said.
You pretend they said something else?
Sort of. You take their proposition, maybe it's nuanced, and you interpret it in a completely different way. A way that's much easier for you to attack. Then you refute that interpretation and claim victory.
It's like changing the subject subtly, reframing the core issue.
It is, or moving the goalposts, as you said earlier. And stratagem 12 fits right in here, especially with abstract ideas.
Like freedom or justice.
Exactly. When you're debating those big concepts, you strategically choose language. You use words with positive connotations for your liberty, empowerment, security, and you use inherently negative or loaded terms for their position control, chaos, restriction, even if the underlying ideas are complex or related.
You're essentially embedding the conclusion in the language you choose.
That's a great way to put it. And this often involves confusing the issue altogether, which brings us to Stratagem 6, and maybe the most insidious, Stratagem 24.
Stratagem 24. The false syllogism. This one feels important for understanding things like, well, online misinformation spirals. How does it work exactly?
It's about creating a false chain of logic. You take the opponent's original, maybe perfectly reasonable, statement, let's call it P.
Okay, statement P.
Then you introduce one or more faulty or manipulative intermediate steps X and Y. These might sound plausible on their own, or maybe they just play on existing fears.
Right.
And through this distorted chain, P leads to X, X leads to Y, you arrive at a conclusion Z that is absurd, terrifying, or totally unacceptable.
So the audience sees Z, this horrible outcome.
And they trace it back, wrongly, to the opponent's original harmless statement, P. They conclude P must be bad because it seems to lead to Z. The faulty logic in the middle, X and Y, gets overlooked.
Can we walk through a quick example, make it concrete?
Sure. Imagine someone argues for, say, better funding for climate science research, P.
Okay, seems reasonable.
An opponent using Stratagem 24 might say, okay, so you want more funding, P. That means higher taxes for everyone, X. Maybe true, maybe not, but it's step one.
Step X, higher taxes.
And higher taxes, X, always stifle the economy and lead to job losses, Y. Again, debatable, but it's the next link.
Step Y, economic harm.
Therefore, they conclude, what you're really advocating for with P is crippling our economy and making people poor, Z.
Wow. So the original call for research funding gets twisted into wanting economic collapse.
Exactly. The audience hears the scary outcome Z and rejects P. Even though the logical links X and Y were flawed or exaggerated, it's distortion through false inference. Very common, very effective. Hashtag tag 1.2. Psychological and audience manipulation.
Okay, so that first cluster of strategies messes with logic and language. This next group seems much more direct, hitting the opponent psychologically or playing the audience.
Yes, these are less about the argument structure and more about the people involved.
And the one that just leaps off the page, because you see it constantly, is making the opponent angry. Stratagem 8.
Oh, yes. A cornerstone tactic. Schopenhauer was quite clear. Provoke your opponent to anger.
Why? What's the advantage?
Because anger impairs judgment. When you're angry, you're less capable of rational thought. You lose sight of the argument's strengths and weaknesses. You might say things you regret.
You get sloppy. You expose yourself.
Precisely. You make rash statements, reveal weaknesses. An angry opponent is often a losing opponent purely because their emotional state undermines their reasoning.
And Schopenhauer even adds, with Stratagem 27, that if you notice a particular point really gets under their skin.
You double down. You press that specific point with even more enthusiasm.
Ouch.
That anger, that disproportionate reaction, signals to you that you've likely found a weak spot in their argument, or perhaps even a personal sensitivity they haven't properly considered, so you exploit it. Keep poking until they lose control.
It sounds less like debate and more like psychological warfare.
In narcissistic terms, it absolutely is. The goal is victory, not enlightenment.
Okay, what if your own arguments are weak? You can't rely on logic. What then?
Then you might reach for Stratagem 30, the appeal to authority, but not necessarily a legitimate appeal. You say authorities that your opponent respects, or seems to respect. Maybe a famous philosopher, a scientific body, a sacred text.
Okay, standard enough.
But Schopenhauer adds, you should feel free to quote them out of context, twist their meaning, or even, well, invent a quote if necessary.
Invent a quote?
Seriously.
He was quite blunt about it.
Or, quote, an authority the opponent admires but doesn't truly understand. The goal is to overwhelm them with the appearance of authoritative backing, whether it's real or not. People are often impressed by what they don't fully grasp.
And if quoting authorities, real or fake, doesn't work,
then perhaps sheer verbal firepower. Stratagem 36. Bewilder them with jargon and bombast.
like using overly complex language on purpose.
Exactly. Drown them in technical terms, learned-sounding phrases, dense sentences. Make your argument sound incredibly profound and complicated, even if it's hollow.
The implication being that if they can't follow it, they must not be smart enough, so they won't dare challenge it.
That's the idea. It's intimidation through vocabulary. We see this a lot in, say, pseudoscientific arguments or overly academic disputes where complexity itself becomes a weapon.
Which leads us nicely to the ultimate target.
Yeah.
The audience. Stratagem 28, playing to the crowd. This seems tailor-made for social media.
Absolutely. It works best when the audience is an expert in the topic, which is almost always the case online or on TV.
So how do you play to them?
You make an objection to your opponent's point that might be logically invalid, maybe even completely wrong, but it sounds good. It's simple, punchy, and makes the opponent look silly or defeated.
Maybe it gets a laugh.
Even better, laughter from the audience is a powerful signal of victory, regardless of the facts. The key is that your opponent's correct rebuttal would likely be long, complicated, full of nuance.
And the audience won't stick around for that. They just see the quick, seemingly devastating jab and the laughter.
Exactly. The visible win, the soundbite, trumps the detailed truth. The audience declares you the winner based on the performance, not the substance. Hashtag tag 1.3. Deflection and interruption.
This is all pretty bleak, isn't it? Did Schopenhauer offer any hope? Or was he just documenting the dark arts?
He framed it more as essential knowledge for self-defense. You need to understand these tactics because they will be used against you. He saw humans as naturally contentious, often prioritizing ego and victory over truth. So knowing the weapons is necessary, whether you choose to use them or just defend against them.
Okay, so if you're on the ropes, if you feel the argument slipping away, you need escape strategies, like Stratagem 26, turning the tables.
Ah, a very clever one. Rhetorical judo, essentially. You take the very argument your opponent is using and somehow turn it against them.
How would that work?
You might show that their line of reasoning actually undermines their own position if applied consistently, or that the principle they're advocating for actually supports your conclusion in a different context. Or you could point out a hypocrisy, where their argument conflicts with their own stated values or actions. You use their own momentum against them.
Clever. But if that doesn't work and defeat looks imminent,
then you need to divert. Stratagem 29, diversion.
Just change the subject.
Pretty much, yes. If you see you're about to be definitively refuted on point A, you suddenly introduce point B, seemingly related, but actually different. You pivot.
Does it have to be related?
Ideally, you find some vague connection so it doesn't look completely random. But the goal is to shift the focus away from the area where you're losing onto new ground where you might stand a chance, or at least confuse the issue.
And if even diversion isn't possible, if they're closing in for the kill.
The emergency eject button, Stratagem 18, stop the argument.
Just stop.
Yes. If you see they are building towards a conclusion that will clearly demonstrate your error, you have to prevent them from reaching it. Interrupt, create a distraction, declare the discussion unproductive, break it off entirely.
Better to seem rude or abrupt than to be proven wrong publicly.
In heuristic terms, absolutely. Preserve the appearance of not having lost.
Which brings us to the final, ultimate stratagem. The one that feels like the signature move of online arguments today. Stratagem 38.
The argumentum ad personam. When all else fails, when you know you've lost on logic and evidence, you abandon the topic completely.
And you attack the person.
You become personal, insulting, rude. You attack their character, their intelligence, their appearance, their motives, anything but their argument.
Why is this one so popular, as Schopenhauer noted?
Because anyone can do it. It requires zero intellect, zero knowledge of the subject, zero argumentative skill. It just requires malice and a willingness to be offensive. It shifts the focus from the issue to the individual, often provoking an emotional reaction and derailing any chance of rational discourse. It's the scorched earth tactic of debate.
It really is almost depressing how well Schopenhauer's 19th century observations map onto the 21st century internet. But okay, part 2, let's dig into the why. Why do these tactics, especially attacking the person or their feelings, work so well? Why do they often seem to beat facts?
Right. We move from Schopenhauer's what the tactics themselves to the why from modern psychology and communication research. This brings us squarely to the appeal to emotion, the argumentum ad passiones.
So bypassing the brain and going straight for the heart or maybe the gut?
Essentially, yes. It's a manipulation technique that aims to win not by providing solid evidence, but by triggering feelings, fear, anger, pity, patriotism, love, hate. When a message sparks a strong emotional response, it tends to stick. It becomes more memorable, more likely to be shared, and often more likely to be accepted as true, even if the logical basis is weak or non-existent.
It cuts through the clutter.
It really does. In our information-saturated world, emotion is a powerful filter and motivator. Hashtag 2.1. The psychological mechanics of emotion. And this isn't a new discovery. Thinkers have known about emotions' power for millennia. Aristotle himself warned that our judgments change drastically depending on whether we're feeling joy or sorrow, love or hate.
So it fundamentally colors our perception of facts.
It does. Later, in the 18th century, the philosopher George Campbell had this interesting idea of emotions as handmaids, to reason, potentially helpful, guiding reason. But he immediately warned they're easily seduced by sophistry, meaning clever but false arguments can easily hijack emotions to lead reason astray, making us accept falsehoods because they feel right.
That feels very relevant today. So which emotions are most potent for persuasion?
Well, looking at negative emotions, fear is probably the most studied. Research consistently shows that fear-based appeals grab attention. They make people break from their routines and actually process the persuasive message.
Makes sense. Fear forces you to pay attention to potential threats.
Exactly. And this heightened attention can lead to political engagement, attitude change, even behavior change, if the message also offers a way to alleviate the fear.
What about anger? We talked about provoking anger in an opponent, but can it be used to persuade the audience?
Yes, anger is also very powerful. Like fear, it's associated with more central, careful information processing. People really dig into the message that made them angry. Studies have shown, for example, that evoking anger about an issue like crime can make people more receptive to punitive policies proposed to address it.
But isn't there a risk? Like with provoking an opponent, doesn't careful processing mean they might see through the manipulation?
It's a double-edged sword. Anger focuses attention, yes, but it also tends to simplify thinking. It promotes certainty and reduces the search for nuance. So while people process carefully, they might process within a very narrow, anger-fueled frame, making them susceptible to simple, heuristic solutions that match their feeling.
Okay, and what about guilt? We see guilt appeals in charity ads, for instance.
Guilt can work, but it's tricky. It needs to be evoked moderately. If you lay it on too thick, if you induce excessive guilt,
People push back.
they often do. It can trigger resentment, anger towards the source of the guilt appeal, or defensive avoidance. So persuaders have to find that sweet spot, enough guilt to motivate action, but not so much that it backfires.
Fascinating. And on the positive side, compassion, especially thinking about stories of individual victims.
Absolutely. Compassion is incredibly powerful, particularly when focused on identifiable individuals. We seem wired to respond more strongly to the plight of one specific person we can see and connect with, rather than abstract statistics about mass suffering.
The identifiable victim effect.
Exactly. A single story, a single face can trigger a massive outpouring of support and action, often far exceeding what a purely rational statistical assessment might call for. It bypasses calculation and hits directly at empathy. Hashtag 2.2. The effectiveness of the personal attack. Ad hominem.
Okay, so emotions are potent tools. Let's circle back specifically to Stratagem 38, the ad hominem attack. Attacking the person, not the argument. Logically, it's usually a fallacy, right? Irrelevant to the truth of the claim.
Usually, yes, though there are some edge cases where character might be relevant. For example, if a scientist is presenting data, their history of funding or past retractions could arguably be relevant to assessing the credibility of their current claim. If a politician makes a promise, their track record of keeping promises seems relevant.
So sometimes it's not strictly a fallacy.
Logically, it can sometimes bear on the plausibility or trustworthiness of the source, which indirectly affects the argument. But the real power of ad hominem, especially online, isn't its logical relevance. It's its psychological effectiveness. It works by destroying the speaker's credibility in the audience's eyes.
Undermining the source, so the message is dismissed regardless of its actual merit.
Precisely. And we have solid experimental evidence now showing just how effective this is. There were these crucial experiments testing different kinds of attacks on science claims.
Right, comparing attacks on the data versus attacks on the scientists. What did they find?
The findings were quite surprising, even to the researchers. Finding number 1, certain types of ad hominem attacks were just as damaging as attacking the actual evidence.
Their types.
Specifically, allegations of past scientific misconduct and allegations of conflict of interest. Attacking the scientist's integrity or suggesting bias was found to have the same negative impact on public attitude towards the claim as directly challenging the empirical basis, the data itself.
Wow. So calling the scientist a cheat was as effective as showing their data was flawed.
In terms of shifting audience opinion, yes, that was a major finding.
And what about combining attacks? Is hitting both the data and the person even more powerful?
You'd think so, right? That was the hypothesis. But it turned out to be wrong. That's finding 2. Attacks are substitutive, not additive. Meaning, once you've successfully landed one type of attack, either questioning the data or questioning the scientist's integrity, adding a second type of attack didn't really increase the negative impact much further.
So once trust is broken by one means, piling on doesn't do much more damage.
It seems that way. The first effective hit does the job of undermining credibility or belief.
Okay, this is fascinating. Finding 3 looked at different kinds of personal attacks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Attacking competence versus attacking integrity.
Yes, and this is perhaps the most insightful part, linking back to models of trust. Researchers looked at attacks targeting the scientist's ability at things like calling them sloppy, questioning their education or methods.
Attacks on competence.
Right, and those attacks. They had basically no significant impact on the audience's attitude towards the science claim.
Seriously. Calling them sloppy didn't matter.
Not significantly. People seem relatively forgiving of perceived incompetence, perhaps viewing it as just human error. But attacks targeting the scientist's benevolence, their goodwill, whether they act in the public interest, and especially their integrity, their honesty, adherence to ethical principles.
Like misconduct or conflict of interest.
Those were devastatingly effective. It really boils down to this. Integrity trumps ability when it comes to trust and persuasion in these contexts.
So you can forgive someone for being maybe a bit careless, but not for being deceitful or biased.
That seems to be the psychological mechanism. Once the audience perceives a lack of integrity or good faith, the basis for trusting anything that person says collapses, regardless of how competent they might be, or even how solid their data might actually appear if examined objectively. The integrity attack poisons the well completely.
All right, we've got Schopenhauer's cynical blueprint. We've got the psychological evidence for why emotional and personal attacks are so potent. Now let's bring it all together and look at this stuff in action. In the wild, online, specifically that clash between organized digital hate groups and the people trying to counter them.
Right. We're looking at a specific case study involving groups like Reconquista Germanica or RG, representing a kind of structured digital hate campaign, and their opponents like Reconquista Internet, RI, which was set up as a civil society effort aiming to counter hate with, quote, love and reason.
Love and reason versus, well, Schopenhauer's playbook, basically.
Pretty much. And what's crucial is that both sides, despite their different approaches, seem to understand the real game. It's not about convincing each other. It's about influencing the silent audience, the people reading the comments, scrolling through the feed, hashtag 3.1, the blueprint of digital hate, RG.
So RG, they had this leaked handbook for media guerrillas. Sounds dramatic, but it laid out actual tactics, right?
Yeah.
Shitposting, memes, coordinated raids.
Yes, it was a documented strategy, promoting mimetic warfare using memes to spread ideology and organizing social networking raids to flood specific discussions or hashtags. The clear objective was the systematic spread of hateful content, primarily xenophobic, to distort the perception of public opinion.
Make it seem like these views are more widespread than they are.
Exactly. To foster polarization and normalize hate, and their methods were textbook heuristic dialectic, updated for the digital age.
Like what specifically?
Well, first, humiliation and provocation. Their handbook explicitly encouraged using insults, always trying to get the last word in an argument, a classic dominance display.
And that swinging the Nazi club tactic.
Yes, that was about turning accusations of racism or Nazism back onto their critics, trying to neutralize the charge through deflection and counter-accusation. They even advised creating fake profiles in their opponents' names to post offensive or ridiculous content to discredit them.
Pure ad hominem and misdirection. Stratagems 38 and 3 again.
Textbook. Then there's the crucial tactic of emotionalizing discourses. This wasn't just random anger, it was structured.
How so?
It involved weaving together unrelated events or themes into a single toxic narrative. For instance, taking an isolated crime, maybe a tragic murder, and linking it explicitly to other unrelated incidents allegedly involving people from a specific minority group, often refugees or Muslims.
Creating a pattern where none necessarily exists.
Precisely. Connecting dots, often falsely, to build a narrative that triggers strong negative emotions. Fear, outrage, hatred directed at an entire group. This technique is central to creating what scholars call dangerous speech.
Dangerous speech meaning?
Speech that doesn't just express hatred, but actively increases the risk that the audience will condone or participate in real-world violence against the targeted group. It shifts attitudes towards accepting violence, and alongside this, pervasive whataboutism and misinformation.
Whataboutism, the classic diversion tactic. Stratagem 29.
Exactly. They used misleading comparisons constantly. The example given was comparing deaths of refugees at sea to road traffic deaths in Germany, a way to relativize the tragedy and deflect calls for action or empathy. It shifts the frame entirely.
And just spreading false information.
Yes, pushing conspiracy theories was key, things like the white genocide narrative or the Great Replacement theory, or using metaphors like the red pill, borrowed from the Matrix, suggesting followers need to wake up to the ugly truth being hidden by the establishment, the Lügenpresse, or lying press.
So, attacking mainstream sources, creating an us versus them mentality, fueling distrust.
Absolutely. It builds a cohesive, albeit false, worldview based on grievance and suspicion, perfectly suited for avistic combat. Hashtag 3.2, counterspeech and its limits, RI.
Okay, so that's the offensive playbook. What about the defense? Reconquista internet, RI. Try and counter this with love and reason. Their approach sounds much more dialectic, right? Focus on facts, expose manipulation.
That was the stated goal. Their strategy was based on mutual respect, using factual reasoning, and specifically aiming to uncover and explain the manipulative tactics being used by groups like RG. They even compiled resources on things like Schopenhauer's Stratagems to educate their counter-speakers.
Trying to fight heuristic tactics by exposing them? Sounds noble. Did it work?
Well, the research suggests it faced significant challenges in practice. The idealism often hit a wall against the realities of online conflict.
How so? What were the main failures?
First, there was an internal issue. Many of RI's own counter-speakers struggled to stick to their own ethical code of civic standards.
Meaning they got dragged down into the mud.
Essentially, yes. Instead of staying objective and focusing on facts, they frequently ended up resorting to personal attacks themselves, making emotional or provocative comments, using abusive language.
So Stratagem 38, the personal attack, ended up being used by the side trying to promote reasoned debate.
It happened often. The antagonistic nature of the exchanges seemed infectious. Debates often devolved into these sort of moralizing contests, my side's victims outnumber your side's victims, rather than actual engagement with arguments or facts. They adopted heuristic tactics despite their intentions, and the second major failure was external. Fact-checking and rational arguments often just didn't land.
People didn't change their minds when presented with facts.
Frequently not. There's this tendency for people, especially on charged topics, to overestimate how much they already know. When presented with contradictory evidence or scientific data, instead of reconsidering.
They just dig in. I've done my research or I know enough already defense.
Exactly that. They simply refuse the evidence, insisting their existing understanding was sufficient. Objective reasoning failed to persuade those already committed to a narrative.
This leads to a really troubling finding. Counterspeech, even when well-intentioned, could sometimes backfire, make things worse.
There's a risk of that, yes. When counterspeech doesn't effectively refute the hateful claims or change minds, it can inadvertently give the hateful discourse more visibility and legitimacy. It creates discussability.
Meaning, just by engaging with it, you make it seem like a valid topic for debate.
Precisely. It can signal that these extreme views are part of the normal spectrum of opinion worthy of discussion. The debate descends into polarization rather than resolution. However, it's important to add that despite these limitations, counterspeech is still seen as crucial.
Why? If it doesn't always work, it can backfire.
Because silence can be interpreted as agreement. If hateful narratives go completely unchallenged, the audience might assume they represent a consensus or are widely accepted. The presence of counterspeech, even if imperfect, at least disrupts that illusion. It signals opposition and prevents the unopposed normalization of hate. And this whole dynamic, this often futile-seeming clash between hate speech and counterspeech, isn't just about the individuals involved. It's amplified, maybe even driven, by the platforms themselves.
You mean Facebook, Twitter, places like that? They aren't neutral ground.
Far from it. They aren't designed as calm, rational, debating societies aiming for consensus. Their fundamental architecture, their technological affordances, often actively reward heuristic argumentation. Manipulation can be the path of least resistance to visibility.
So the medium isn't just carrying the message, it's shaping the fight. It's tilting the table toward Schopenhauer's strategies.
That's a very good way to put it. The platform itself encourages certain types of engagement. Hashtag 4.1, platform affordances and visibility. Think about the algorithms. How does content get seen on a platform like Facebook? It prioritizes what it deems most relevant.
Which usually means
comments and posts with lots of engagement, likes, shares, replies, and what kind of content gets that engagement? Often it's the provocative, the emotional, the controversial, the very stuff that characterizes heuristic debate.
So the system automatically boosts the loudest, most inflammatory voices.
It often does. Calm, nuanced, factual arguments might get less engagement and therefore sink, while simpler, angrier, more manipulative posts rise to the top. There's also evidence suggesting the first comment or speaker has a disproportionate effect on the overall tone and direction of the discussion.
And organized groups know this. They game the system.
Absolutely. Groups like RG didn't just rely on rhetoric. They understood algorithmic politics. Their handbook mentioned calculating exactly how many posts per hour were needed to get a hashtag trending in Germany, for example. They treated visibility as a technical challenge to be overcome.
Coordinating efforts to manipulate what seems popular.
Yes, and this is hugely amplified by the use of technology itself. Social bots, fake accounts. These allow a small number of actors, a loud minority, to create the illusion of widespread support.
Platform hatred, creating a false sense of majority opinion.
Exactly. It's a deliberate distortion of the public sphere, making fringe views seem mainstream by exploiting the platform's mechanics.
And then you have memes, the logic of lulz. How does that fit into the heuristic arsenal?
Memes are incredibly effective heuristic tools for the digital age. They distill complex, often hateful ideologies, like the conspiracy theories we mentioned, into simple, shareable, emotionally resonant packages.
Easy to digest, easy to spread.
And often ambiguous. They frequently use humor, irony, or absurdity, the logic of lusts. This does several things. It makes the message more engaging. It can help bypass simplistic content moderation filters.
Because it's just a joke.
Precisely. And it serves to ridicule and antagonize opponents, reinforcing that us versus them dynamic. It shuts down productive debate by framing everything as either mockable or offensive, rarely as something to be seriously discussed. It essentializes everything into simple binaries. Hashtag 4.2, regulatory gaps and power hierarchies. And the platform's own rules, or lack thereof, often make this worse. Content moderation policies usually prohibit explicit hate speech.
But there's always a but.
But they often carve out exceptions for things like humor, satire, or opinion, and this protection of ambiguity is something hate groups rely on heavily. It plays right into Poe's law.
Let's quickly define Poe's law again.
Poe's law is the observation that online, without a clear signal of the author's intent, it's basically impossible to tell the difference between genuine extremism and a parody of extremism.
So if a hateful message is wrapped in irony or presented as satire,
it becomes very difficult for moderators and other users to be sure if it's genuine hate or just edgy humor. This ambiguity provides cover. Extremists can push boundaries, and if challenged, claim they were misunderstood or just joking.
which puts a massive burden on moderators.
An almost impossible one. Relying on platforms to effectively police this is often wishful thinking. Decoding intent, understanding cultural context, navigating irony across millions of posts in multiple languages. It requires huge resources, nuanced understanding.
And maybe platforms aren't always incentivized to try that hard.
Well, there's certainly an argument that controversy drives engagement. More comments, more clicks, more time on site. That's often good for the platform's bottom line, even if the engagement is toxic. So inaction can sometimes align with business interests.
Which creates a power imbalance.
Definitely. Users who understand how the algorithms work, how to use bots and fake accounts, how to exploit regulatory loopholes and ambiguity, they have a significant advantage. They can manipulate perception much more effectively than those who engage in good faith.
It really underscores the need for critical digital literacy, doesn't it? Understanding how the system itself works.
Absolutely. Without that understanding, you're navigating a battlefield where the rules are invisible to you but exploited by others. We're relying on private companies with their own priorities and no real democratic accountability to manage core spaces of public discourse. And that's fundamentally problematic when it comes to tackling things like organized cyber hate. So when you look at this whole picture, this constant, often antagonistic battle online, it really just confirms a fundamental truth about politics, doesn't it? That it has this unavoidable antagonistic dimension, this struggle over meaning, over whose narrative wins. The digital world, far from ushering in an era of rational consensus, seems to strongly resist that optimistic view. It often amplifies conflict and confirms that the heuristic strategies Schopenhauer described are alive and well, perhaps more powerful than ever.
Yeah, the essential takeaway feels pretty stark. Whether you're looking back at old philosophical debates or scrolling through social media today, it seems the most effective tools for winning arguments, for persuading the audience,
often have very little to do with facts or logic. They target our emotions, they attack people's integrity, they rely on rhetorical tricks and sheer force of personality or repetition. The entire digital environment often seems tilted away from careful, truthful dialogue, dialectic, and towards this cynical, weaponized form of argument heuristic. We are, in a way, constantly witnessing this autopsy of rational discourse playing out. But maybe, just maybe, recognizing the tools being used against you, spotting the exaggeration, identifying the appeal to emotion, seeing the strategic shift to a personal attack, maybe that recognition is the first crucial step. Understanding the structure of the argument, understanding the weapons being deployed, that's essential if you want to navigate the debate happening all around you.